Before the century turned, there was a feeling in the air, though no one could quite name it. The streets still echoed with the rhythm of horse hooves on cobblestone, and yet wires hung above every corner, like veins waiting for something electric to stir. Storefront windows glowed softly after dusk, some lit by gas, others by this new thing called current. People walked with purpose, dressed for a world that no longer quite matched the one they remembered. The factories never slept. The trains arrived like thunder, and the newspapers seemed to grow thicker by the week, each headline louder than the last. At dinner tables and barber chairs, folks spoke of change the way one might speak of weather, a thing that came whether you liked it or not. But in their quieter moments, perhaps just before sleep, some might have wondered where it was all heading. Because sometimes just before a century changes its name, the world tilts ever so slightly. And if you listen close enough, you can almost hear it, the creak of history leaning forward. The Progressive Awakening. It began with the hum of machines and the scent of coal dust in the morning air. At the dawn of the 20th century, America stood like a restless giant. She had conquered her frontiers, built cities that scraped the sky, and stitched herself together with railroads and telegraph lines. But the cost of all that progress was beginning to show, especially to those who could not afford the ticket forward. Factories ran day and night, filled with tired hands and tired eyes. Children as young as 8 stood beside whirring looms in textile mills, their small fingers better suited for the dangerous work. In the tenements of New York and Chicago, families stacked into rooms not much larger than closets where water dripped from the ceilings, and rats had no fear of people. And yet there was a stirring, a slow rising hunger for fairness. A new century brought new voices, writers, activists, thinkers, who believed that America could be better if only she paused long enough to look inward. They called it the Progressive Era. One of those voices belonged to President Theodore Roosevelt. He took office in 1901 after the assassination of William McKinley, and at just 42, he became the youngest president the country had ever seen. Full of energy, he viewed the presidency not as a quiet stewardship, but as what he called a bully pulpit, a place from which to shape public opinion, challenge big business, and defend the common man. Roosevelt was no stranger to contradiction. He was born into wealth, yet waged war on the wealthy. He spoke of peace, yet adored military valor. He broke up monopolies, battled corrupt railroads, and pushed Congress to pass laws that would later form the backbone of modern consumer protection. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 came partly in response to The Jungle, a searing exposé by Upton Sinclair that described the horrors of Chicago's meatpacking industry. Americans who had read the book suddenly looked at their dinner plates with suspicion, and Roosevelt made sure their concern turned into legislation. But Roosevelt's America was not only about reform. It was about identity, who the nation was becoming in a world that was moving faster than ever. There were two Americas, and they were drifting apart. One was gilded and powerful, full of millionaires who dined in private clubs and traveled by private rail car. The other was crowded, tired, and foreign-speaking, with new immigrants arriving daily from Southern and Eastern Europe clutching paper suitcases and hopes written in unfamiliar alphabets. Ellis Island processed more than 1 million people in 1907 alone, the highest single year on record. Entire neighborhoods changed overnight. Little ateliers and Jewish quarters grew in every major city. Some Americans felt threatened, others saw promise. Still others, like the reformer Jane Addams, opened settlement houses, places where new immigrants could learn English, receive childcare, and get help finding jobs. Women, too, were finding their voice. The suffrage movement was no longer content to hold quiet meetings in parlors. By 1908, women marched through the streets of New York demanding the right to vote, holding banners and facing jeers. Figures like Susan B. Anthony had laid the groundwork, but it was new leaders like Alice Paul who would push the movement into a more confrontational phase in the years ahead. The fight for workers' rights also burned hotter with each passing season. In Pennsylvania's coal country, miners organized strikes that shook entire industries. In 1902, Roosevelt became the first president to side publicly with labor against a major company during the anthracite coal strike. The precedent was subtle, but powerful government was no longer just the ally of capital. It could, in moments, stand between the people and unchecked power. Still, progress came in waves, some swift, some painfully slow. For Black Americans in the South, little had changed. Jim Crow laws ruled with quiet cruelty. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and lynchings kept many from the ballot box or from living free in any real sense. Booker T. Washington advocated for vocational education and economic self-reliance, while W.E.B. Du Bois called for immediate civil rights and helped found the NAACP in 1909. Du Bois believed that democracy could not wait. He called for what he described as the talented 10th, an educated black elite who would lead the race forward. His vision clashed with Washington's, but both men were responding to the same brutal truth. The promise of freedom after the Civil War remained unfulfilled for millions. Meanwhile, technology and invention raced ahead. In 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright flew for 12 seconds in a powered machine over the sands of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. It did not seem like much at the time. Few realized that it was the birth of aviation, a moment that would within decades shrink the world. By 1908, the first Model T rolled out of Henry Ford's factory in Detroit. It cost $825, still out of reach for most Americans. But Ford had a plan. He would soon introduce the moving assembly line, reducing production time from 12 hours to just over 90 minutes. The car would become cheaper. The worker would become part of a new industrial rhythm. The world once measured by horses and trains was about to be reimagined in wheels and roads. As the decade drew to a close, the American spirit was caught in a curious tension. The country had never been so modern, so bustling, so full of invention. And yet beneath that optimism lay deep questions about fairness, equality, and the true meaning of progress. People sat on porches at night and read their newspapers by the light of kerosene or new electric lamps. They saw stories of corruption and reform, of labor strikes and suffragists, of airplanes that soared and trusts that fell. And maybe as they folded their papers and listened to the distant clang of a streetcar, they asked themselves the same question. Was this the beginning of a better world, or just a faster one? Voices before the war. By the time the second decade of the 20th century unfolded, something in the American soul had begun to tighten. The air felt heavier, as if a storm were waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. But at home, the noise was not of cannons. Not yet. It was of speeches, protests, courtrooms, and picket lines. Woodrow Wilson became president in 1913. A former professor and president of Princeton University, he entered office with the quiet intensity of a man who believed ideas could shape nations. He spoke of a new freedom, a vision of democracy, purified from the grip of monopolies and political machines. And for a while, his words stirred the country. Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, reorganizing the nation's banking system into a central body that could prevent the sort of panics that had rattled Wall Street for decades. He also pushed through the Federal Trade Commission, aiming to keep business fair and competition honest. And for the first time, a national income tax took root, authorized by the recently ratified 16th Amendment. But for all his achievements, Wilson governed a nation divided, not just between rich and poor, but by gender, race, and place of birth. The women's suffrage movement was growing bolder. By 1915, women had won the right to vote in several Western states, but the East resisted. Marches turned into mass arrests. Picket signs turned into hunger strikes. In 1917, women stood silently outside the White House gates, holding signs that asked Mr. President, "How long must women wait for liberty?" They were not alone in their demands. Across the country, laborers fought for shorter workdays, safer conditions, and fair pay. The industrial workers of the world, known as the Wobblies, preached radical change. Their meetings echoed with songs, and their strikes often ended in blood. In 1914, at a coal camp in Ludlow, Colorado, striking miners and their families were attacked by the Colorado National Guard. Tents burned, women and children died. The Ludlow Massacre, as it came to be known, pierced the national conscience. It became harder after that to pretend that all was well inside America's house. Even the arts were rumbling with unrest. The Harlem Renaissance had not yet begun, but its roots were already deep in black communities. Jazz found its first breath in New Orleans saloons. Poets and playwrights spoke of a different America, one made of struggle and beauty, of alienation and pride. In 1912, W.E.B. Du Bois published The Quest of the Silver Fleece, a novel that blended realism with mythology to explore the experience of black life in the South. It was not just protest, it was prophecy. Immigration continued to surge. Ellis Island processed its final wave of newcomers before the war changed everything. Italians, Poles, Jews, Greeks, many fleeing poverty pogroms, or the promise of a new world poured into American cities. They brought their languages, their religions, their labor, and their longing. Yet they also met walls, suspicion, and a rising tide of nationalism. In 1911, a fire tore through the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. Doors had been locked from the outside. Escape routes were blocked. In less than 20 minutes, 146 workers, mostly young immigrant women, were dead. The image of women leaping from windows to escape the flames haunted the nation. Reformers seized the moment. Laws changed, but grief lingered longer than outrage. And then there was Mexico. In 1914, President Wilson sent U.S. troops to occupy the port of Veracruz, citing insults to the American flag. The real reasons were tangled in revolution and oil. By 1916, the border had become a stage for chaos. Pancho Villa, once a revolutionary hero, raided Columbus, New Mexico. In response, Wilson dispatched General John J. Pershing into Mexico in pursuit. They never caught Villa. But America was learning a lesson: its reach could extend far, but not always with control. As the nation wrestled with its own identity, the world across the Atlantic caught fire. In 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo. What followed was a chain reaction of treaties' pride and old resentments. Europe was plunged into war. Trenches carved into French soil. Poison gas floated above no man's land. The old empires bled youth into the mud. At first, America watched from afar. President Wilson urged neutrality in thought as well as deed. Most Americans agreed. It was not our war, they said. Let the old world settle its old scores. But neutrality proved more fragile than it seemed. German U-boats patrolled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships. In 1915, the British ocean liner Lusitania was torpedoed, killing over 1,000 people, including 128 Americans. The outcry was fierce, yet still, Wilson held the line. Meanwhile, industry boomed. American factories built for war without joining it. Wheat flowed to Europe. Steel, oil, and textiles crossed the ocean. Wall Street found its pockets deepening. Peace, it seemed, could be profitable too. But the pressure mounted. The Zimmermann telegram, intercepted in early 1917, revealed a secret proposal from Germany to Mexico. If the U.S. joined the war, Mexico should attack, and in return, Germany would help it reclaim Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. The message was inflammatory. It turned American skepticism into something closer to resolve. By the spring of 1917, Wilson addressed Congress with a voice changed by circumstance. "The world must be made safe for democracy," he declared. Days later, America was at war. Yet in those final months before the drums of Europe called our sons to battle, there was still space to wonder. What kind of country had America become? It was a place of possibility and protest, a land of innovation and inequality, a nation too complex for slogans, too restless for stillness. Its cities crackled with electricity and dissent. Its countryside whispered old prayers and fresh fears. Its leaders debated what it meant to be free and who got to claim that freedom. And beneath it all, the people went about their lives, marrying, mourning, moving westward or upward or inward, reading the headlines, listening to the phonograph, watching the sky, which no longer felt so distant now that men could fly. In that sliver of time before the Great War swept away the illusions of innocence, America stood on a narrow bridge between the old century and the new world order. And even if the people did not know exactly what was coming, many could feel it like a breeze before the rain. Not fear exactly. Something deeper, a quiet, unavoidable reckoning. War, espionage, and the making of a power. The war arrived quietly at first, through headlines, through telegrams, through the sound of new uniforms being stitched and ships being outfitted. But once it began, the momentum was impossible to ignore. On April 6, 1917, Congress voted to declare war on Germany. And just like that, the United States entered the Great War. It was not just soldiers who went to battle. The entire nation mobilized. The Selective Service Act was passed within weeks, and millions of young men registered for the draft. By the end of the war, more than 2 million American troops had crossed the Atlantic. They were known as doughboys. Some had never seen the ocean before. Many would not return. President Wilson, always more comfortable with words than weapons, framed the war as a moral mission. He spoke of ending all wars, of fighting for democracy, of bringing justice to a weary world. But behind the noble language, a different machine was humming. At home, the government moved swiftly to control information. The Espionage Act of 1917 made it a crime to interfere with the war effort or to speak against the draft. A year later, the Sedition Act expanded those limits further, criminalizing speech that was disloyal or critical of the government. In theory, these laws protected the nation. In practice, they silenced dissent. Socialist leader Eugene V. Debs gave a speech criticizing the war and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Newspapers were shut down. Mail was censored. Neighbors reported on neighbors. The boundaries between patriotism and paranoia blurred. Liberty required loyalty. At least that was the message. Meanwhile, industry was transformed. The War Industries Board coordinated production, deciding who made what and how much of it. Farmers were told what to grow. Citizens were urged to conserve. Food will win, the war posters declared. Americans planted victory gardens, rationed sugar, and skipped meat on Mondays. Women filled jobs vacated by men. They worked in munitions factories, drove streetcars, ran telegraph lines. Thousands volunteered as nurses both at home and overseas. The suffrage movement, long seen as a nuisance by some politicians, suddenly looked indispensable. If women could serve their country in war, how could they be denied the vote in peace? And then came the war itself. In the trenches of France, the war was not noble. It was muddy, chaotic, deafening. American troops joined the Allied forces in battles like Belleau Wood and the Meuse-Argonne offensive. They faced gas attacks, machine gun fire, and the grim reality of industrialized killing. The war that Wilson had sold as a crusade turned out to be a grinder of flesh and spirit. Still, their arrival made a difference. Germany, already stretched thin, could not match the fresh energy of the American forces. In November 1918, the armistice was signed. The fighting stopped. Bells rang out across cities and small towns. Strangers embraced in the streets. A generation had survived something unimaginable. But peace did not bring unity. In 1919, Wilson traveled to Paris to shape the Treaty of Versailles. He hoped to create a League of Nations, a body that would prevent future wars through diplomacy and collective security. He believed so deeply in this idea that he refused to compromise. He spent months abroad, the first sitting president to do so, for such a length, while his opponents at home grew restless. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, a sharp and calculating rival, led the opposition. He did not trust Wilson's vision of global cooperation. He believed in American sovereignty. In the end, the Senate refused to ratify the treaty. The United States would never join the League of Nations. Wilson, already weakened by the strain, suffered a massive stroke in October 1919. For months, his wife Edith acted as a gatekeeper, controlling access to the president and effectively running the executive branch in secret. The country did not know. The press did not report it. For a time, the democracy ran on silence. Back home, the end of the war had not brought calm. Quite the opposite. Returning soldiers found jobs scarce. Racial tensions erupted. In the summer of 1919, what came to be called the Red Summer race riots broke out in dozens of cities. In Chicago, a black teenager swimming in Lake Michigan drifted into a whites-only area and was stoned to death. The violence that followed left dozens dead and neighborhoods burned. Labor unrest also surged. That same year, 350,000 steelworkers went on strike. Boston police officers walked off the job and looting erupted. Governor Calvin Coolidge called in the National Guard and refused to reinstate the strikers. "There is no right to strike against the public safety," he said. The line between order and injustice had never felt thinner. Fear of revolution swept the nation. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had inspired both hope and horror around the world. In the United States, anarchists mailed bombs to prominent officials. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer launched a crackdown. Thousands were arrested in the Palmer raids. Many were deported without trial. It was the first Red Scare. Fear once again became policy, and amid it all came an enemy no bullet could stop. In 1918, a new strain of influenza began to spread, first among soldiers, then across oceans, then into every corner of civilian life. The Spanish flu, as it came to be known, infected nearly 1/3 of the world's population. In the United States, it killed over 600,000 people, more than all the war's battle deaths combined. Entire towns shut down. Schools closed. Funerals were rushed and lonely. People wore masks and whispered prayers. Doctors gave advice, but medicine had no answers. The war had shown the might of man. The flu reminded them of his limits. By the end of 1919, America was exhausted. It had emerged from the war as a global power, its economy strong, its military proven. But inside the country was fractured by fear, by illness, by unfulfilled promises. And yet it stood. Not triumphant, not at peace, but undeniably changed. The flag still waved from front porches. Children played in alleys and fields. The newspapers were thick with headlines about the treaty, the flu, the unrest, the future. And somewhere, as the new decade inched closer, someone folded that paper, looked out at a frost-covered street, and wondered. After all that death, all that sacrifice, all that noise, what comes next? The Roaring Illusion. By 1920. America longed for quiet. After years of war, disease, and unrest, the country was ready to exhale. And when Warren G. Harding campaigned for the presidency that year, he offered exactly what the nation craved, a return to normalcy. It was not a real word, not back then. But it did not matter. People heard it and imagined front porches, steady paychecks, and evenings without headlines. Harding won in a landslide. The 1920s would become known for their energy for jazz and flappers and automobiles. But in those first few years, the surface sparkle barely hid the deeper shifts underway. The census of 1920 revealed for the first time that more Americans were living in cities than on farms. The old pastoral dream, the one with wide fields and white fences, was fading. Skyscrapers rose like ambition, and neon lights buzzed into the night. Prohibition had officially begun. The 18th Amendment, ratified in 1919 and enforced through the Volstead Act, banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. But instead of sobering the nation, it lit a new kind of fire. Speakeasies flourished behind unmarked doors. Bootleggers built empires overnight, and the mob, once a neighborhood nuisance, became a national force. Chicago's Al Capone earned millions by defying the law, while federal agents scrambled to keep up, outgunned and outmaneuvered. In homes across the country, people poured gin into teacups and learned to dance the Charleston. Jazz spilled from radios and record players, the first true soundtrack to modern American life. Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, and Louis Armstrong were changing music forever. Their rhythms traveled from Harlem to the heartland, from backrooms to ballrooms. But beneath the pulse of pleasure, anxiety lingered. The Red Scare of 1919 had not fully faded. In 1920, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, two Italian immigrants and self-described anarchists, were arrested for robbery and murder in Massachusetts. The evidence was thin. The trial, though, was thick with fear and xenophobia. Both men were convicted. Their execution would come years later, but their case sparked worldwide protests and revealed just how fragile justice could be when mixed with panic. Immigration became a national obsession. Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act in 1921, restricting the number of newcomers allowed into the country. The message was clear: the gates were closing. For many, America was no longer a beacon but a fortress. The Ku Klux Klan, dormant for decades, returned with a vengeance. No longer just a Southern phenomenon, it now held rallies in Indiana, Oregon, and even Washington, D.C. Members wore robes and burned crosses, not just to intimidate Black Americans, but also Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. At its height, the Klan boasted millions of members and wielded real political power. And yet this was also the moment when women claimed a long-denied right. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, granting women the vote nationwide. It had taken nearly a century of petitions, marches, and arrests. Susan B. Anthony did not live to see it. But younger activists like Alice Paul watched the ballots drop and knew history had finally shifted. Harding's presidency, however, would not last long. He was genial, popular, and deeply ill-equipped for the backroom dealings of Washington. He surrounded himself with old friends, many of whom viewed government as an opportunity rather than a duty. Scandals began to pile up. The worst was the Teapot Dome affair, in which government officials secretly leased federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes. It would become one of the biggest political scandals in American history, rivaling only Watergate decades later. But Harding did not live to see it unravel. In 1923, he died suddenly during a speaking tour in San Francisco. The official cause was a heart attack. Rumors of stress and betrayal followed him to the grave. His vice president, Calvin Coolidge, took the oath of office in the quiet of his family's Vermont farmhouse by the light of a kerosene lamp. Coolidge was everything. Harding was not stoic, frugal, silent. Reporters joked that he could be in a room for hours and never utter a word. He once said, "The business of America is business," and he meant it. Coolidge slashed taxes, trimmed regulations, and watched the stock market climb. Industry boomed, factories churned, Wall Street cheered. To many, this was the American dream realized. Ownership of radios, washing machines, and automobiles soared. Henry Ford's assembly line had made the Model T cheap enough for the middle class. Highways stretched outward, and motels sprouted along them. Families packed into tin-roofed cars and chased horizons they had only read about. But all this movement, the buying, the driving, the dancing, masked a deeper truth. Farmers were struggling. Prices for crops had dropped after the war. Debt mounted. In states like Iowa and Kansas, farms were foreclosed by the thousands. Sharecroppers in the South, especially black families, remained trapped in cycles of poverty that no election seemed able to break. Unions lost power. Strikes failed. The courts often sided with employers. The wealth created in cities did not trickle far. The illusion of equality was just that, an illusion. Even as the country celebrated invention, some looked skyward and saw more than progress. In 1920, the Army established the Air Service. 2 years later, the first coast-to-coast airmail delivery was completed. The age of flight had begun to settle into the public imagination. It would not be long before Americans wondered what else they could reach. But the future still felt distant. For now, the country was dancing. At night, the cities pulsed with light. Jazz bands played late into the evening. Lovers rode in open-air cars along dusty roads. Radios crackled with baseball scores and gospel choirs. And on front porches, people leaned back in wicker chairs and told themselves that the storm had passed. They wanted to believe it, that the war was behind them, that the system worked, that the good times would last. Because sometimes when the night is just loud enough and the drinks just sweet enough, even an entire country can convince itself that nothing could possibly go wrong. The edge of a fall. By the mid-1920s, America gleamed. Radios played in nearly every home. Movie theaters flickered in every city. The stock market rose with a rhythm that felt more like destiny than luck. And yet there was something about the way people talked in those days, a kind of urgency beneath the laughter, as if they knew somewhere deep down that good times borrowed too long must eventually come due. Calvin Coolidge remained in the White House quiet and watchful. He did not believe in government as a force for change. He believed in restraint. His favorite answer to questions was silence. When asked if he planned to run again in 1928, he simply said, "I do not choose to run." And with that, he stepped aside. But before he left, he oversaw an America glowing with consumerism. Installment buying, paying in small pieces over time, allowed people to own radios, refrigerators, and even cars they could not afford outright. Department stores towered in urban centers. Advertising became an industry unto itself, promising happiness in every bottle of soda and every tube of toothpaste. Credit flowed easily. Stockbrokers offered buying on margin, allowing investors to borrow most of the money needed to purchase shares. As long as the market climbed, everyone profited. It felt easy. Too easy. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic from New York to Paris. The feat stunned the world. At just 25, Lindbergh became the most celebrated man in America. Overnight, he went from airmail pilot to living legend. But his fame was a symptom, not a cause. The country craved heroes, symbols, something or someone, to make sense of its own momentum. And the motion was relentless. Skyscrapers climbed higher. In New York, the Chrysler Building began its ascent. Hollywood produced hundreds of films each year, and the first talkies gave the silent screen a new voice. Jazz moved north to Chicago and Detroit, reshaping culture as it went. The Harlem Renaissance bloomed in full. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay gave voice to Black life in America, with a mix of celebration and sorrow. Their words danced and mourned, asked questions the country was not ready to answer. In smoky clubs and narrow walk-ups, the future of American art was being written, bold, restless, and unafraid. Politically, though, the surface remained calm. In 1928, Herbert Hoover won the presidency in a landslide. A self-made man, orphaned young, he had risen through sheer effort and discipline. He promised a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. For many Americans, it seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Hoover believed in markets. He believed in the individual. And as he took office, the economy looked bulletproof. Wages were up. Unemployment was down. Factories were humming. The press spoke of permanent prosperity. The phrase appeared in newspapers, on radio shows, even in sermons. But permanence is a fragile thing. Farmers, already hurting since the early 1920s, saw prices fall further. Mechanization meant fewer laborers were needed. Many rural families were living in quiet crisis, their struggles drowned out by the urban roar. Banks, especially in smaller towns, were undercapitalized. Few had safeguards in place. The Federal Reserve, created a decade earlier, had yet to develop the tools or instincts to manage an overheated economy. It watched the market with caution, but little action. The wealth gap widened. While cities built penthouses, many Americans lived without indoor plumbing. The top 1% held more than a third of the nation's wealth, and yet these details rarely made the front page. Because front pages were full of ticker tape and ticker symbols, the stock market became a national obsession. Ordinary clerks and school teachers were investing. So were shoe shiners and barbers. The numbers always seemed to go up. The New York Stock Exchange became a kind of altar. Brokers shouted orders like prayers. People gathered outside to watch the ticker roll. It felt like a machine that could only reward. But machines can overheat, and bubbles, no matter how carefully inflated, eventually burst. Throughout 1929, warnings flickered. In March, the Federal Reserve issued a cautious statement about excessive speculation. Stocks dipped, then recovered. Over the summer, cracks appeared: bank loans, stretched thin inventories piled up, and steel production slowed. But few paid attention. In late October, the market began to shake. On October 24th, known later as Black Thursday, panic selling began. Banks and investors rushed in to stabilize prices. It worked for a day. Then came Black Monday. Then Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929. 16 million shares changed hands. Fortunes vanished in hours. Suicides followed. Brokers leapt from windows. Phones rang endlessly. The illusion was broken. It would take days, weeks, even for the full scale of the collapse to register. But in that final year before the fall, America had danced too close to the edge. And yet, if you had walked through Manhattan in the spring of 1929, you might not have known. Couples still sipped cocktails in rooftop bars. Elevators still carried men in pinstripes to offices where they made deals with confidence and speed. Music still poured from radios. Children still played hopscotch on sidewalks. It was a season of ordinary dreams. That is how illusions work. They are not built on ignorance, but on the refusal to pause, to ask, to doubt. So the country did what many people do when everything feels too good. It leaned in, and somewhere deep beneath the noise, a quiet voice might have whispered, "This cannot last." The Great Unraveling. The crash did not come with thunder. It came with silence. Silence in the banks, as tellers looked up and said, there was nothing left. Silence in the homes where fathers stared at dinner tables they could no longer fill. Silence in the cities where men lined up for blocks, coats worn thin, eyes hollow. By the end of 1929, the roaring had stopped. What followed was not a single collapse, but a slow, grinding unraveling. Month after month, the foundations gave way. Factories closed, farms failed, entire industries shrank like wool in cold water. By 1930, unemployment reached 9%. By 1932, it was 24%. 1 in 4 Americans who wanted work could not find it. Bread lines stretched across blocks. Soup kitchens opened in church basements and back alleys. Men once proud of their professions now stood in silence, holding tin cups. Children looked up at mothers who had nothing left to cook. The word that began to appear in newspapers was Hooverville, named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover. These makeshift shanty towns sprang up in parks under bridges in the forgotten corners of cities. Built from scraps of metal, wood, and cardboard, they were cities of the displaced. Entire families lived there. Babies were born there, and no one knew when or if they would leave. Hoover, once a symbol of self-made success, seemed paralyzed. He believed the market would correct itself. He believed that aid should come from local charities and private citizens, not the federal government. He feared that handouts would erode the American spirit. But the spirit was already breaking. Banks failed by the hundreds. People rushed to withdraw their savings, only to find the doors locked. There was no insurance, no safety net. When a bank fell, life savings disappeared. Retirement vanished. Hope turned into questions no one could answer. Farmers already drowning in debt before the crash now faced falling prices and rising costs. Wheat rotted in silos because it cost more to ship than to sell. Milk was poured into ditches. Corn was burned for heat. A farmer in Iowa once said, "We are starving in the middle of plenty." And still the skies began to change. In the Great Plains, decades of over-farming had stripped the soil. Then the rain stopped. The winds rose. The land dried and cracked. And in 1930, the first dust storms rolled across Oklahoma and Kansas, turning day into twilight. The Dust Bowl had begun. Black blizzards, they called them. Walls of dirt that swallowed everything. Fields, fences, hope. Cattle died where they stood. Crops never rose. And families packed their things onto battered trucks, heading west to California, chasing rumors of jobs that rarely existed. They were called Okies, though many came from Texas, Arkansas, and beyond. John Steinbeck would one day write about them, but in these years, they were too tired to tell stories. They just drove. One more town, one more harvest, one more day. In Washington, the calls for action grew louder. Veterans of World War I promised bonus payments for their service, but not due until 1945, marched to the Capitol in the summer of 1932. They came by the thousands pitching tents along the Anacostia River. They called it the Bonus Army. They were peaceful. They sang songs. They waited. Hoover ordered them removed, and when police failed, he sent in the army. General Douglas MacArthur, with tanks and tear gas, cleared the camp. Fires broke out. People fled. Infants choked on smoke. The images made front pages nationwide. Americans could not understand why their government had turned its might on its own veterans. And yet, even in the darkest days, people found ways to endure. Radio became a kind of lifeline. Families huddled close to hear comedians like Will Rogers or the calming voice of President Hoover, though few found comfort in his words. Music lifted weary spirits. Gospel choirs echoed through cities. In juke joints and dance halls, jazz still played. In 1931, the Empire State Building was completed. It stood tall over Manhattan, a strange monument to ambition in a time of despair. For months, much of its upper floors sat empty, a skyscraper with no tenants, an empty promise stretching into the sky. And still the people voted. In November of 1932, they chose a new voice. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He had once been struck by polio, left without the use of his legs. But he stood tall in spirit. He spoke of hope, of action, of the forgotten man. He promised a new deal. And for a country that had tried waiting and praying and blaming, something new was exactly what they needed. But that was still to come. In the final winter before Roosevelt took office, America lay shivering, not just from the cold, but from the weight of its own unraveling. Businesses boarded up. Men drifted from city to city, hopping freight trains in search of work. Children went to bed hungry and woke up older than their years. Yet lights still flickered in windows. Church bells still rang. Mothers still tucked in their children with stories and promises they hoped would come true. And in that fragile quiet, the country seemed to ask itself, if this is how far we have fallen, what will it take to rise again? The New Deal and the spark of recovery. They came to see him in wheelchairs and wagons, in farm trucks and borrowed cars. They wrote him letters, hundreds of thousands of them, some pleading, some accusing, most simply asking if he saw them. Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office in March of 1933, and by then, America was barely breathing. 1 in 4 workers had no job. 2 million people were homeless. The nation's banking system teetered on the edge of total collapse. He stood on the Capitol steps that chilly day, braces hidden beneath his long coat, and said calmly, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." People listened, and for the first time in years, they believed. Within days, Roosevelt acted. He declared a 4-day national bank holiday, closing every bank in the country. It was a pause, an attempt to stop the panic. And then he spoke directly to the American people, not through newspapers or speeches in crowded halls, but through the radio. His first fireside chat aired on March 12, 1933. Families gathered around their sets listening as Roosevelt explained how banks worked, why they failed, and what would happen next. He spoke not like a politician, but like a neighbor. The next morning, people returned to the banks not to withdraw, but to deposit. Confidence, it turned out, was a kind of currency too. Congress under Roosevelt's leadership moved swiftly. In his first 100 days, a flurry of new programs reshaped the American landscape. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work planting trees, building trails, and restoring national parks. The Works Progress Administration employed artists, teachers, and laborers alike, painting murals, paving roads, building schools. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity to rural communities that had never seen a light bulb glow after sundown. Farmers who had lived by candlelight, now cooked by stove, listened to radio and watched electric fans stir the summer heat. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to reduce crop production, hoping to raise prices and slow the ruinous overproduction that had gutted rural America. For the first time, Washington reached deep into the soil, telling farmers when and how to plant. The National Industrial Recovery Act aimed to regulate wages and hours in industry, trying to stabilize prices and revive consumer spending. It also recognized the right of workers to unionize a shift as seismic as anything happening in finance. It was not perfect. Many of these programs excluded Black Americans or offered them the lowest-paying roles. In the South, New Deal projects often reinforced segregation. Discrimination, like poverty, proved stubborn, but for the first time in years, help was visible. People went to work. Checks arrived. Towns stirred. Children who had gone to bed hungry now carried school lunches wrapped in wax paper. Men who had drifted from state to state found work clearing forest roads or digging irrigation canals. They sent money home sometimes, just a few dollars, and their families taped the bills to the kitchen wall as proof that something finally was changing. Roosevelt did not just rebuild roads and banks. He rebuilt the idea that government could be a force for good. He spoke often, reassuringly. In fireside chats, he explained complex policy with warmth and clarity. "It is common sense to take a method and try it," he once said. "If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something." That spirit experiment to just try again became the heartbeat of the New Deal. Not everyone approved. Conservatives called him a traitor to his class. Business leaders warned of creeping socialism. The Supreme Court struck down several early programs, including the NRA and parts of the TOAA, arguing they exceeded federal power. In response, Roosevelt pushed for new laws, new versions, new strategies. He was relentless, not perfect, but determined. And the country slowly responded. The economy inched upward. By 1935, unemployment had fallen, though it still hovered above 20%. Banks were steadier. The stock market showed signs of life. People began to buy again, not extravagantly, but enough to keep shop doors open and factory floors humming. In 1935, the Social Security Act was signed into law. It promised a small monthly payment to retired workers. It also offered unemployment insurance and aid to disabled Americans and dependent children. For the first time, the federal government acknowledged that old age and misfortune should not mean abandonment. It was a modest check, but a monumental idea. And still beneath all the rebuilding pain lingered. The Dust Bowl worsened. Dust storms rolled across the plains like punishment, burying fences and barns in thick brown layers. Families wore wet cloths over their mouths, sealed windows with newspaper, and swept dirt from their tables each morning before breakfast. Many left. They headed west to California to citrus groves and canneries, only to find that there too the jobs were scarce and the welcome uncertain. They were Americans, but treated like strangers. And yet, they kept moving, kept working, kept voting. Roosevelt's opponents coalesced around men like Father Charles Coughlin, a radio priest with a growing audience, who accused the New Deal of helping bankers more than workers. Huey Long, governor of Louisiana, called for a radical redistribution of wealth under his Share Our Wealth plan. He warned that Roosevelt was not going far enough. But Roosevelt pressed on. In the summer of 1936, he accepted the Democratic nomination for a second term. In his speech, he named his enemies big business monopolies, reckless bankers. "They are unanimous in their hate for me," he said, "and I welcome their hatred." It was bold, and the people listened. When Election Day came, Roosevelt won 46 of 48 states. In the quiet of those voting booths, America had made a choice, not just for a man, but for an idea. That government in its best form was not distant or cold. It could build bridges, it could build hope, and as the decade's midpoint passed, the country still carried scars, but also something else. A faint, flickering belief that it might yet survive itself. Because sometimes, when the storm has passed and the soil still clings to your boots, you stop to listen. And if you listen long enough, you can almost hear it again, the sound of a nation remembering how to stand. Shadows of another war. The winds were shifting again. You could not always see it in the newspapers, not yet. But something in the air had begun to cool, to harden. The factories were busy, the radios still full of laughter. But somewhere across the Atlantic, boots were marching, and the echo was drawing near. By 1936, Franklin Roosevelt stood on firmer ground. His New Deal had not ended the Great Depression, but it had given people something even more important: motion. The unemployment lines were shorter, the soup kitchens less crowded, and though the scars remained, America had begun to feel like it was building toward something, rather than merely surviving. But trouble was growing abroad. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had consolidated power, rearmed his military, and begun to speak more openly of expansion. His words were sharp, but his actions sharper. In 1936, he marched troops into the Rhineland, violating the Treaty of Versailles. The world watched and did nothing. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, invaded Ethiopia that same year. The League of Nations protested, but its voice had become a whisper. In Spain, civil war broke out. Fascists, led by General Francisco Franco, clashed with Republicans. Hitler and Mussolini sent arms and troops to support the fascists. The Soviet Union backed the Republicans. The conflict became a testing ground, a dress rehearsal for the larger war many feared was coming. In America, the response was hesitant, cautious, almost reflexively isolationist. The wounds of the Great War still ached. Most Americans wanted no part of another European conflict. Congress passed a series of neutrality acts between 1935 and 1937, restricting arms sales and loans to nations at war. The message was clear: stay out. Roosevelt privately worried. He saw the danger growing, but he understood the mood of the country. So he spoke carefully, walking a line between realism and reassurance. At home, there was still much to fix. In 1937, Roosevelt made a bold and controversial move. Frustrated by Supreme Court decisions that had struck down parts of the New Deal, he proposed adding more justices, one for every justice, over the age of 70 who refused to retire. It became known as the court-packing plan. The backlash was swift even among his allies. People feared he was tampering with the balance of power. The plan failed, but the warning was clear: even in crisis, Americans cherished their checks and balances. That same year, the economy dipped again, a sharp downturn, known as the Roosevelt recession. Federal spending had been reduced, and private investment had not yet filled the gap. Unemployment rose once more. Critics called the New Deal a failure, but Roosevelt adjusted, increasing spending again and reinforcing the programs that had begun to take root. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, another storm was building. Japan, hungry for resources and power, invaded China in 1937. The war was brutal. The bombing of Shanghai, the massacre at Nanking, these were not far-off tragedies to those who read the morning paper. They were warnings. The world was unraveling in new ways. Still, America held back. Even as Jewish refugees fled Germany, even as fascism grew louder, the U.S. accepted only a trickle of immigrants. The SS St. Louis, a ship carrying over 900 Jewish refugees, was turned away from American shores in 1939. The passengers were forced to return to Europe. Many would later die in the camps. It was not hatred always that drove these decisions. Often it was fear. Fear of change. Fear of being pulled into another catastrophe. Fear that helping others might mean falling back into crisis at home. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. France and Britain declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. Roosevelt responded with measured urgency. The U.S. began supplying weapons and materials to the Allies under the cash and carry policy. In 1940, he signed the first peacetime draft in American history. And that same year, breaking tradition, he ran for a third term and won. No president had ever done that, but the times were not ordinary, and people knew it. In his inaugural address, Roosevelt spoke not of recovery, but of defense. The Nazi masters of Germany have made it clear that they intend not only to dominate all life and thought in their own country, he warned, but also to enslave the whole of Europe, and then to use the resources of Europe to dominate the rest of the world. Americans still resisted entering the war, but they were beginning to understand that it might come, whether they chose it or not. In 1941, Roosevelt pushed for the Lend-Lease Act, allowing the U.S. to supply Britain, China, and later the Soviet Union with weapons and goods on credit. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he said, and with that, American factories began to shift from refrigerators to rifles, from typewriters to tanks. The nation was not yet at war, but it was no longer at peace either. That year, Roosevelt met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill off the coast of Newfoundland. Together, they issued the Atlantic Charter, a vision for the post-war world, based on self-determination, free trade, and shared security. It was not a treaty, but it was a promise. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning in December, the illusion of distance ended. December 7th, 1941. Japanese planes attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Battleships burned. Over 2,400 Americans died. The next day, Roosevelt stood before Congress and declared it a date which will live in infamy. War was declared on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The world was no longer a map of distant events. It was here now, immediate, unavoidable, and on fire. In kitchens and churches and factory floors, Americans gathered to listen to the radio. Many wept, many clenched their jaws, and in that moment, the long shadow of war became a floodlight. But before the bombs fell, before the uniforms were stitched, before the stars were painted on the wings of planes, there had been something else, a flicker, a knowing. Because some part of America had always felt it coming, not with dread, but with the cold logic of history. That when one world begins to burn, it does not take long for the smoke to cross the sea. Into the fire. The day after Pearl Harbor, enlistment lines wrapped around city blocks. Young men waited quietly, some in uniform already, others in borrowed suits. They held papers, not questions. They knew what they were doing. The United States was at war, and everything changed. Factories that once made washing machines now produced bombers. Typewriter companies turned to rifles. Rubber, copper, and aluminum were rationed. Nylon stockings vanished, taken for parachutes and powder bags. Gasoline was rationed too, as were sugar and butter. People pinned ration books to their walls, marked dates with pencil, waited in lines that circled neighborhoods. It was not just sacrifice, it was shared purpose. Women poured into the workforce. They ran machines, welded steel, managed logistics. They became pilots, clerks, and engineers. Rosie the Riveter was not just a poster. She was real. Her name was Rose, and Helen, and Maria, and they carried the weight of an entire nation's hope on their shoulders, while their brothers and sons sailed across oceans. By 1942, the United States was fighting on two fronts, the Pacific and the European. In the Pacific, battles unfolded on islands. Most Americans had never heard of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima. The fighting was brutal, inch by inch. The enemy never surrendered. Tropical heat mixed with gunpowder, coral beaches soaked in blood. Every victory was bought dearly. In Europe, American troops joined British and Soviet allies to push back the Nazi war machine. North Africa, Sicily, Italy, then France. The most daring came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. The sky was low, the sea was gray. Bullets cut through the surf, and still they moved forward. They climbed cliffs, dragged wounded friends to safety, wrote letters in foxholes. They carried photographs in their helmets of wives, of mothers, of small children, too young to understand why Daddy left with a duffel bag and a kiss. But war did not just live overseas. At home, it reshaped everything. Schools held air raid drills. Cities enforced blackouts. Factories ran around the clock. War bonds were sold in movie theaters between reels. Celebrities toured to rally support. Americans grew victory gardens, collected scrap metal, saved bacon grease for explosives. The unity was real, but not equal. After Pearl Harbor, fear turned inward. In early 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced relocation of over 120,000 Japanese Americans. They were sent to internment camps, barbed wire, wooden barracks, armed guards. 2/3 were American citizens. They lost homes, businesses, dignity. No charges were filed. No trials were held. They brought their sewing machines, family photos, and silence. In the segregated South, Black Americans were called to fight for a country that still denied them a seat at lunch counters. They served bravely in Europe and the Pacific, even as they were denied promotions, housing, and respect. The Tuskegee Airmen flew missions no one believed they could fly. They came home heroes, and still faced whites-only signs. But the war cracked something open. The Double V campaign victory abroad and at home spread through black newspapers. It was a quiet revolt, a question whispered beneath every uniform: if I can fight for democracy over there, why not here? Jewish Americans watched with growing horror as word of the Holocaust began to spread. At first, the reports seemed impossible. Camps, gas chambers, entire families, gone. By 1944, it could no longer be denied. The photographs, the testimonies, the silence of villages emptied. 6 million Jews murdered. And the world for too long had looked away. In April 1945, American troops liberated Buchenwald and Dachau. What they saw broke them. And yet, even as that truth came to light, the war pressed forward. In the Pacific, the island-hopping strategy pushed American forces closer to Japan. Each island became harder. Each fight cost more lives. At Iwo Jima, the Marines raised a flag atop Mount Suribachi. The photograph became iconic, but it did not capture the screams, the smoke, the men who did not live to see the flag rise. Japan would not surrender. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt died suddenly of a cerebral hemorrhage. He had been president for 12 years. His death shocked the nation. People wept openly. Children cried in classrooms. Strangers hugged in the streets. They did not all agree with him, but they had followed him through the hardest years of their lives. Harry S. Truman, a former haberdasher from Missouri, now held the burden. He had been vice president for just 82 days. He was briefed on a secret project one Roosevelt had overseen in silence: the Manhattan Project. For years, scientists had worked in desert laboratories, racing to split the atom before the Nazis could. Now the weapon was ready. In July, the first successful test exploded in the New Mexico desert. The sky turned white. The ground trembled. Truman faced a choice no human had ever faced. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Over 100,000 people died instantly. Thousands more followed from burns and radiation. 6 days later, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Across America, people poured into the streets. They kissed strangers, danced on sidewalks. Church bells rang. Flags waved. And for a moment, the weight lifted. But in quiet corners, people stared into space and wondered what had been unleashed. The GI Bill was signed into law, promising education and housing to returning veterans. Families reunited. Children born in these years would be called the baby boom. Suburbs spread, highways lengthened, but behind it all was the memory of beaches stained red, of telegrams delivered in silence, of a war that touched every life and left no soul unchanged. Because war, even when won, leaves behind ghosts. And somewhere in that joyful, grieving, exhausted country, someone turned off the radio, closed the blackout curtains for the last time, and whispered, "Now what do we do with peace?" After victory, a divided world. The war was over, but the quiet felt uneasy. Victory banners still hung from porches. Soldiers came home to parades, kisses, and small-town mayors handing out keys to the city. But beneath the brass bands and bunting, something had shifted, something permanent. America had won the war. But the world it inherited was nothing like the one it left behind. Europe lay in ruins. Cities once full of light and language were now piles of ash and memory. Families wandered roads with no destination. Children played in the shells of bombed-out buildings. And the United States, geographically untouched, economically revived, now stood alone at the top. But it was not alone for long. The Soviet Union, battered but unbroken, emerged from the war with a red flag raised high over Eastern Europe. Stalin did not retreat. He installed governments loyal to Moscow in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. He promised peace, but moved like a general. And for every step westward he took, America grew more wary. The alliance that had defeated Hitler was already fraying. In 1946, Winston Churchill visited Missouri and stood beside President Truman to deliver a warning. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, he said an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The term stuck, and so did the fear. At home, the post-war years were a paradox: prosperity and paranoia, growth and suspicion. The GI Bill transformed the country. It offered veterans low-interest loans, job training, and money for college. Millions of young men who once stormed beaches now filled classrooms. They bought homes in neighborhoods that had not existed 5 years earlier. Suburbia was born in this moment, not just as a place, but as a dream. Rows of identical houses sprang up in places like Levittown, New York. They had green lawns, white fences, and floor plans no one needed to think too hard about. Predictability became its own kind of comfort. Television flickered into American life. By 1949, nearly 1 million homes had one. Families gathered each evening around small glowing screens, watching game shows, variety hours, and black and white dramas. The country, once tethered by newspapers and radio, now began to share images in real time. But not everyone shared equally. Black veterans returned home from fighting fascism, only to find Jim Crow waiting at the bus stop. In the South, lynchings still occurred. In the North, housing covenants kept neighborhoods segregated. The promise of democracy abroad rang hollow in places where a black man could not try on a suit in a department store without being followed. In 1948, President Truman issued Executive Order 99981 desegregating the armed forces. It was a bold move and a quiet one. It did not solve everything, but it was a start. The Democratic Party fractured that same year. Southern Democrats, furious at Truman's civil rights stance, broke away to form the Dixiecrats. They nominated Strom Thurmond, a fierce segregationist, as their candidate. The country was changing, and some were determined to hold it still. Truman, facing long odds, ran for re-election against Republican Thomas Dewey. Polls predicted a clear Dewey win. Newspapers printed headlines in advance. And yet, when the votes were counted, Truman had won. He held up a copy of the Chicago Tribune, with its now famous mistaken headline, "Dewey Defeats Truman." He smiled wide and worn, but even in victory his gaze turned east. Because while America debated housing prices and home appliances, the world was dividing faster than anyone could stop. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine was announced. It promised American support to any country resisting communism. Greece and Turkey were the first recipients. It was not about charity. It was about chess. Every move counted. That same year, Secretary of State George Marshall proposed an economic recovery plan for Europe. The Marshall Plan poured billions into rebuilding infrastructure, reviving industries, and stabilizing governments. It was practical, it was generous, and it was strategic. A hungry continent might listen to Moscow. A fed one might choose democracy. The Soviets rejected the aid and forbade their satellites from accepting it. The divide was now economic, as well as ideological. In 1948, Berlin became the flashpoint. Germany had been split into zones, American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, was also divided. When the Western Allies introduced a new currency and began rebuilding West Berlin, Stalin blocked all road, rail, and canal access to the city. 2 million people were trapped, surrounded by Soviet forces. America responded with planes. The Berlin airlift lasted nearly a year. At its height, planes landed every 45 seconds delivering food, coal, medicine. Children waved from rooftops as pilots dropped candy tied to parachutes. It was a humanitarian act, yes, but also a clear signal. The Cold War had begun, not with guns, but with crates of flour and tanks of fuel. Not with a declaration, but with strategy, patience, and the hum of propellers. That same year, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO was formed. It was a military alliance between the US, Canada, and several Western European nations. An attack on one would be considered an attack on all. The world was drawing lines, and behind those lines, new fears crept in. In America, whispers of communists in government began to rise. Congressional hearings turned into accusations. The FBI watched professors and poets. Neighbors watched each other. A man's bookshelf could become a liability. So could his friends. By 1949, the Soviet Union had tested its own atomic bomb. The monopoly was over. Now 2 powers could destroy the world, and they both knew it. That year, Mao Zedong declared victory in China. The world's most populous country had fallen to communism. In Washington, the news landed like a hammer. The sense of containment, of keeping communism penned in, was slipping. And in the suburbs, where lawns grew neatly and televisions played softly in the background, parents tucked their children in and turned off the lights. But in the quiet of those evenings, in the spaces between headlines and bedtime prayers, many wondered, was peace just another word for pause? Because the war had ended. The soldiers had come home. The cities were whole again. And yet the world did not feel safer. It felt like a matchbook, waiting. Korea and the cost of containment. The war had ended, but the uniforms stayed pressed. Just 5 years after victory in Europe, and the Pacific American soldiers were packing their duffel bags again. This time, the destination was a narrow strip of land most could not find on a map. Korea, a country split in two by an invisible line and a very visible war. The division had begun as a temporary fix. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to divide the Korean peninsula at the 38th parallel. The North would be administered by the Soviets, the South by the Americans. It was meant to be short-term, a stopgap, until elections could unify the country. But history rarely honors intentions. By 1948, 2 separate governments had emerged. In the North, Kim Il-sung ruled with Soviet backing. In the South, Syngman Rhee took power with American support. Both claimed to be the legitimate government of all Korea. Both waited, and on June 25, 1950, North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel. They did not hesitate. Seoul fell within days. President Truman was caught off guard, but not paralyzed. He did not ask Congress for a formal declaration of war. Instead, he called it a police action, carried out under the flag of the United Nations. But make no mistake, America was at war again. General Douglas MacArthur was placed in command. A hero of the Pacific, MacArthur still carried himself like a Roman consul. He moved with grandeur, he spoke in absolutes, and he promised victory. At first, the war looked grim. South Korean and American forces were pushed to the southern tip of the peninsula, to a small defensive perimeter around Busan. Supplies were rushed in, reinforcements trickled down, the summer heat was brutal, the morale worse. And then came Incheon. In September 1950, MacArthur launched a bold amphibious landing behind enemy lines. The operation was risky, the tides were tricky. The element of surprise was everything. It worked. The North Koreans were caught off guard. Their supply lines were cut. American forces pushed north, recaptured Seoul, and crossed the 38th parallel. Truman gave the green light. The goal was no longer just containment. It was reunification. They marched toward the Yalu River, the border with China. And then winter came. So did the Chinese. In October, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the border. They were called volunteers, but they moved like an army. They overwhelmed American and Allied forces. Incheon was reversed. The push north turned into a retreat south. It was a stalemate wrapped in snow. MacArthur wanted to strike back hard. He spoke openly of bombing Chinese supply lines. Some reports said he considered using atomic weapons. Truman, alarmed, insisted on restraint. MacArthur disagreed publicly. The conflict was no longer just military. It was constitutional. Who made policy, the general or the president? In April 1951, Truman relieved MacArthur of his command. It was one of the most controversial decisions of his presidency. Some called it brave, others called it betrayal. MacArthur returned home to a hero's welcome and addressed Congress with a memorable line. Old soldiers never die. They just fade away. The war did not fade. It dragged on. For 2 more years, the front lines barely moved. Soldiers fought over the same hills, lost them, reclaimed them. It was trench warfare with jet engines and radios. Progress was measured in yards. Thousands died to take a ridge that would be abandoned weeks later. Back home, the war became background noise. Television networks gave updates, but not with urgency. The public grew tired. The soldiers wrote letters that grew shorter. Parents hung flags in windows again. The country had marched into Korea with confidence. It now sat with clenched teeth. By 1952, a new figure entered the stage, Dwight D. Eisenhower. The former Supreme Allied Commander ran for president, promising to end the war. He won by a landslide. He traveled to Korea. He met with commanders. And behind closed doors, he signaled to all parties that America was serious about peace. It worked. On July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed at Panmunjom. The war stopped. But it did not end. There was no peace treaty, no victory parade. The 38th parallel still stood fortified by barbed wire and landmines. Korea remained divided. Families remained separated, and nearly 37,000 American soldiers never came home. The Korean War was the first hot war of the Cold War. It would not be the last. But it did something subtle to the American mind. It changed the definition of war. Victory was no longer about flags on buildings or surrender ceremonies. It was about lines held, ideologies defended, and costs measured in lives spent for stalemate. It also changed the presidency. Truman left office with approval ratings in the 20s. Eisenhower entered with a promise of calm. The country, once fueled by the fire of wartime unity, now craved order, and television gave it to them images of prosperity, sitcoms with laugh tracks, commercials for frozen dinners. But the war never really left. It stayed in the shadows of American policy, in the budgets for defense, in the alliances drawn in the maps of Asia. It echoed in the silent prayers of parents, in the amputated limbs of veterans, in the silence between radio static and breaking news. And somewhere in the back of every American mind, there was a question. If we could not win in Korea, what would happen if the next line broke, because the Cold War was still here, and the world divided by choice and force was not getting smaller, just more dangerous? The conformist 50s and the seeds of rebellion. The war was over, but the tension remained. Not on the battlefield now, but in the living room at the dinner table, in the way people dressed, talked, and lined their picket fences just so. This was the America of the 1950s, a place where everything looked right, felt clean, and sounded like a radio jingle. But not everything was as polished as it seemed. It started with the houses. Across the country, suburbs sprang up like mushrooms after rain. Places like Levittown, New York, offered small identical homes to thousands of returning veterans and their young families. A driveway, a lawn, a television set that was the dream, and for many, it was enough. Men went to work in gray flannel suits. Women stayed home and cooked in gleaming kitchens. Children played with hula hoops and wore saddle shoes. The country was growing. So were its expectations. But underneath all the sameness, something began to stir. In 1954, the Supreme Court handed down a decision that shook the country's foundations, Brown versus Board of Education. It declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional. The language was clear. Separate but equal was no longer the law of the land. But the reaction was anything but unified. In the South, resistance hardened. Governors vowed defiance. Parents pulled children from schools. And in Little Rock, Arkansas, when 9 black students tried to attend a white high school, the governor called in the National Guard, not to protect them, but to keep them out. President Eisenhower responded by sending federal troops. Soldiers escorted teenagers into class, and the nation watched it all unfold on television. It was a new kind of war, not fought in trenches or jungles, but in courtrooms, classrooms, and city buses. And television, oh, that changed everything. By the mid-1950s, nearly half of all American households owned a TV. It was no longer just a box. It was a window into ideal families like the Cleavers, into commercials that promised happiness in a bottle of Coca-Cola, but also into violence, protest, and real-life drama. It brought the world closer and made the gaps more visible. The contradictions were hard to ignore. The country celebrated freedom, yet kept many citizens from voting. It praised equality, yet maintained separate water fountains. It warned of communist thought, while punishing those who simply questioned the status quo. And then there was McCarthy. Senator Joseph McCarthy, with his stack of supposed names and endless accusations, had turned fear into spectacle. He held hearings. He ruined careers. He spoke of enemies within. But in 1954, it finally broke. During the Army McCarthy hearings broadcast live on national television, an attorney named Joseph Welch looked at McCarthy and asked, "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" The room went still. The spell broke, and so did McCarthy's grip. The country exhaled, but not for long, because something else was brewing, something louder, faster, more rebellious. It came through radios late at night on stations kids listened to, with the volume low. It had a beat. It had hips. It had electricity. Rock and roll. Elvis Presley didn't just sing. He moved, and in a country built on restraint, that was enough to cause panic. Parents clutched pearls. Preachers warned of moral decay. But teenagers, they bought the records and shook their shoulders. A generation gap had opened, and music was only the beginning. There were also the beats. Writers like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg scribbled poems and prose that refused to sit still. They challenged the conformity. They traveled. They drank. They questioned everything. They weren't the face of America yet, but they were the whisper of what was coming. And the whisper would soon become a roar. Back in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1955, a woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat. She was arrested. But the movement that followed was anything but quiet. A young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. helped organize a boycott that lasted over a year. People walked for miles to work. Carpools were formed. The buses ran nearly empty, and eventually the courts ruled segregated buses were illegal. Change had begun, but it was slow and painful, and met with fists and fire hoses. Still the seeds were planted. In diners and churches, in jazz clubs and student meetings, people began to say no, to demand better. Not just Black Americans, but women, workers, veterans, immigrants. The country had sold a dream of unity, but now it would be asked to live up to it. Even in foreign policy, the lines were shifting. The Cold War had not cooled. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, a metal sphere orbiting Earth. It beeped, that was all. But it was enough. Enough to make Americans look up and worry. Had the enemy reached space first? Were their missiles better? Schools rushed to improve math and science. Children ducked under desks during nuclear drills, and grown men in Washington argued over budgets, bombs, and orbits. Progress meant fear now. Innovation came with anxiety, and even the American dream, so pristine and packaged, started to show its seams. Because some folks didn't want the same house as their neighbor, or the same job, or the same rules. And by the end of the decade, as 1959 gave way to the 60s, you could feel it, like a tremor under polished tile. The music was louder, the clothes were looser, the questions were harder, and somewhere just outside the suburbs, the 60s waited with smoke in its lungs and fists in the air. The 60s began youth war and revolution. It started with a smile and a haircut. John F. Kennedy stepped onto the national stage in 1960, young, charming, and different. He was not just another politician in a gray suit. He was something else. The television loved him. So did much of the country. When he debated Richard Nixon, it was not about who spoke better. It was about who looked like tomorrow. Nixon sweated under the lights. Kennedy didn't blink, and in an age where TV was now king, image spoke louder than words. Kennedy won, and with him came the talk of a new frontier. He spoke of space, of freedom, of doing things not because they are easy, but because they are hard. It sounded almost poetic. America leaned in, hopeful, inspired. The torch had been passed, he said, to a new generation. But behind the speeches and style, the world was boiling. Cuba had gone communist under Fidel Castro, and in 1961, the CIA backed a group of exiles to invade at the Bay of Pigs. It failed, spectacularly. Kennedy took the blame, and the Cold War got colder. Then came Berlin. Soviets built a wall overnight, dividing the city and symbolizing a world split in two. In the East, control. In the West, freedom, or so Americans believed. But the most terrifying moment came in October 1962. A plane flew over Cuba and spotted something. Long, cylindrical, Soviet missiles, pointed at the United States. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted 13 days, but it felt longer. Americans watched the news with breath held. Families built bomb shelters in their backyards. Children rehearsed duck and cover drills again. The world teetered on the edge of nuclear war. Kennedy and Khrushchev stared each other down, and somehow, just barely, they pulled back. The Soviets removed the missiles. America promised not to invade Cuba. The world exhaled, just barely. But even as the threat passed, the fear did not. Americans had seen the edge, and once you see it, you do not forget how close you came. Back home, something else was brewing, quieter, but no less powerful. The civil rights movement had not paused. It had grown. In 1960, 4 black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, walked into a Woolworth's and sat down at the lunch counter. They were not served. They stayed. The next day, more came. And then more. Sit-ins spread like wildfire. In buses, in restaurants, in city halls, young people put their bodies on the line. They dressed in Sunday best. They spoke with calm voices. And they were met with fists, hoses, dogs, and worse. But they did not stop. Freedom riders rode into the Deep South, testing desegregation laws. Some were beaten. Some were jailed. Some barely made it out. But they kept riding. And the nation watched. Because now everything was televised. And when America saw teenagers bloodied for wanting to vote, for sitting where they were not allowed, for daring to demand dignity, something shifted. Slowly. Painfully. But shifted nonetheless. Meanwhile, the youth, those born after World War II, were growing louder. College campuses became places of protest. Folk music returned, but with new fire. Bob Dylan sang of change. Joan Baez stood with marchers. And somewhere in a coffeehouse in Greenwich Village, someone was writing the next anthem of unrest. Young people were starting to see through the facade. The promise of post-war America, the perfect house, the perfect job, the perfect family was beginning to crack. Some questioned the rules. Others questioned the reasons behind them. And Kennedy, for all his polish, began to see the cracks too. He proposed a Civil Rights Act. He pushed for space exploration. He talked about poverty, about peace. But history does not wait. On November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, the country froze. Kennedy was shot. The young president, the symbol of hope, gone. The news spread not by telegram or paper, but by television-interrupted shows, breaking broadcasts, anchors fighting tears on live air. People wept in their living rooms. Strangers held hands on sidewalks. It was not just the loss of a man. It was the loss of a feeling. That maybe this decade this country was headed somewhere brighter. The 60s had only just begun, but they were already unraveling. The Great Society, Vietnam, and the Eruption. There was a stillness after Dallas. Not quiet, just still. Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath on Air Force One hand, raised beside Jackie Kennedy in her blood-stained suit. No speech, no grandeur. Just a look in his eyes that said, "We are not stopping." And true to form, Johnson did not slow down. He had watched Kennedy promise. Now he would deliver. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed through Congress like thunder. It outlawed segregation in public places. It banned discrimination in employment. For the first time, an American law, race could not be used to deny someone dignity. And Johnson, a Texan through and through, stood there and signed it with 17 pens, each one handed to a different activist, a different soldier of the movement. Martin Luther King Jr. was among them. But Johnson was not finished. He called for a great society, a country where poverty would shrink, where education would rise, where no child would go hungry, and no old man would go forgotten. He launched Medicare, Medicaid. He expanded food stamps. He pushed Head Start for preschoolers, job training for workers, housing for the poor. The war on poverty, they called it. a war fought not overseas, but on city streets and rural roads. And for a while, it seemed possible. But halfway across the world, another war was stirring, one that would consume it all. Vietnam. It had been simmering since the 50s, a divided country North Communist South backed by the United States. Kennedy had sent advisors military help, but after his death, things escalated. In August 1964, a report came from the Gulf of Tonkin. North Vietnamese boats had allegedly attacked an American destroyer. Johnson asked Congress for power to respond. They gave it. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed with barely a question, and with it, Johnson now had what he needed to widen the war. Troops poured in. By the end of 1965, more than 180,000 American soldiers were in Vietnam. The number would triple within 2 years. But Vietnam was no ordinary war. It had no clear front lines, no easy villains. The Viet Cong melted into jungles, struck from shadows, then vanished. American soldiers trudged through rice paddies and rain, unsure if a child was a friend or a threat. Back home, television brought it all into living rooms. Footage of bombings, bodies, burned villages. Names of the dead scrolled across screens. Parents watched and wondered if their sons would be next. College students counted draft numbers with dread. And then there was the burning. In early 1965, a Buddhist monk sat calmly in a Saigon intersection, doused himself in gasoline, and lit a match. His image, still composed, engulfed in flame, spread around the world. It haunted. The promise of the Great Society was now competing with the cost of war. Money was stretched. Trust began to erode. And in the streets of America, people were not staying silent. The civil rights movement had gained momentum. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, born from the bloodshed in Selma, guaranteed the ballot to millions who had long been denied. But protests did not end in celebration. In August of that same year, Los Angeles burned. Watson area, long neglected, erupted after a traffic stop turned violent. 6 days of chaos, dozens dead, hundreds injured, entire blocks reduced to ash. It was not the last. Urban uprisings spread across the country. Newark, Detroit, Chicago, each one sparked by a single moment, but fueled by decades of inequality. And in the middle of it all, music. Motown gave a soundtrack to the moment. Songs about love, pain, change. Bob Dylan wrote like a prophet. Aretha Franklin demanded respect. The Beatles arrived from Britain, mop-haired and unshakable, their sound, as loud as their message was new. Culture was shifting. Long hair, tie-dye, psychedelics. The word counterculture began to appear in newspapers. A new generation was forming, not just different from their parents, but actively opposed to them. On campuses, students organized teach-ins against the war. They burned draft cards in public squares. Some fled to Canada. Others marched through Washington chanting for peace. And then there was the music festival in San Francisco. The Summer of Love was still a year away, but its seeds had been planted. A new idea was growing that love could resist war, that music could challenge power, that young people had something to say, and the world had better listen. Lyndon Johnson watched it all from the Oval Office, the weight growing heavier by the day. He had passed more domestic legislation than almost any president before him. He had lifted millions from poverty. But none of it mattered when Americans came home in flag-covered coffins or when cities smoldered with rage. He gave speeches, tried to explain. He pushed forward. But the country was pulling apart. By the end of 1966, the optimism that had greeted the decade was beginning to feel like a memory. The war dragged on. The movements grew louder. And the dream of the Great Society was fading inch by inch behind the smoke of both jungles and burning cities. The year America broke open. By 1967. The country was vibrating, not just with anger or grief, though there was plenty of that. It was more like the hum of something too tightly wound, too stretched about to snap. You could feel it in the air, in the way people shouted during protests, in the silence between newscasts, even in how neighbors looked at one another tense, uncertain, afraid to name what was coming, but certain it would come. Vietnam was a drumbeat no one could silence. That year alone, over 11,000 American soldiers died in Southeast Asia. Television screens were filled with jungle firefights, helicopters lowering into smoke young men slumped over rifles. And back home, mothers held folded flags, and fathers stared past reporters with eyes that seemed older than they had any right to be. The protests grew louder, bigger, angrier. In October 1967, nearly 100,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. They sang. They marched. Some crossed the river to the Pentagon and were met by bayonets. Students, priests, veterans, poets, they linked arms and asked the government to stop. The answer, if there was one, came in the form of tear gas. That same year, Muhammad Ali was stripped of his heavyweight title for refusing the draft. "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong," he said. The words echoed across the country, especially in black communities, where the draft seemed to pull sons faster than opportunity ever had. Meanwhile, cities were still burning. In July, Detroit erupted. It began with a police raid and ended with 5 days of tanks in the streets. 43 people died. Over 1,000 were injured. The images: flames licking brick walls, children running from gunfire. Soldiers patrolling American neighborhoods looked like a war zone, except it was home. President Johnson formed a commission to study the causes of the riots. The report came back: blunt racism, inequality, neglect. But few in power wanted to hear it, and fewer still wanted to act. Then came 1968. It started with a glimmer of hope. On January 30th, during the Vietnamese holiday of Tet, the North Vietnamese launched a massive surprise offensive. Cities, bases, even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon came under attack. The military pushed back, eventually claiming victory. But the message was clear: the war was nowhere near over. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man on television, went to Vietnam and returned with a rare opinion. "It seems now more certain than ever," he said, "that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in stalemate. When the newsman gives up the country, listens." In March, Johnson went on television. The war was tearing at him. The Great Society was drowning in napalm. He ended his speech with a sentence no one expected: "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." It should have been a moment of peace. It was not. Just 4 days later, Martin Luther King Jr. stood on a balcony in Memphis, Tennessee, where he had come to support striking sanitation workers. He spoke of justice, of unity, of the mountaintop he could almost see. The next day, he was shot dead. The country split open. Riots exploded in over 100 cities. Washington burned. Chicago burned. People wept, shouted, stood stunned in front of TVs. Some prayed. Some packed suitcases. Some loaded guns. Robert Kennedy, campaigning for president, stood on the back of a flatbed truck in Indianapolis. That night, he told the crowd of King's death. He spoke of his own brother's murder, of shared sorrow, of the need to choose love over hatred. The city did not riot that night, but the pain did not stop. In June, Kennedy himself was gunned down in a Los Angeles hotel just after winning the California primary. He had spoken of ending the war, of lifting the poor, of healing. And then he was gone. Another brother, another bullet, another funeral. The Democratic National Convention met that August in Chicago. It should have been a somber gathering. Instead, it became a battlefield. Inside the convention hall, delegates shouted, walked out, refused to endorse a system they no longer trusted. Outside in the streets, police swung clubs at college kids, reporters, anyone who looked like dissent. Tear gas drifted past television cameras. Blood ran down sidewalks. America watched itself unravel live. That November, Richard Nixon won the presidency. He promised law and order, promised to bring the country back to calm. But there was something cold in the way he said it, something that felt less like healing and more like silence, enforced by force. The decade closed, not with peace, but with exhaustion. Too many funerals, too many lies, too many hopes raised and torn apart before they could take root. And yet somehow the country was still standing. A little older, a little angrier, a little more afraid, but still standing. Nixon's America and the long exit from Vietnam. It began as so many American presidencies did, with a promise. Richard Nixon told the country he had a plan to end the war in Vietnam. He called it peace with honor, though no one quite knew what that meant. After the chaos of 1968, King Kennedy, the riots, the blood, the promise of calm, was enough. Nixon won. But peace, as always, was complicated. The war continued. More young men were drafted. More helicopters lifted off from bases halfway across the world. More body bags came home. And the protests kept growing. In 1969, over 500,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C., for the moratorium to end the war. They marched in silence. They read the names of the dead. They lit candles in the dark. Nixon watched from the White House windows and claimed it did not affect him. But the ground was shifting. At the same time, something extraordinary happened. On July 20th, 1969, 2 astronauts stepped onto the moon. Neil Armstrong's words crackled through black and white TVs across the country. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. For a brief moment, America looked up. It felt proud. It felt united. It felt like something good was still possible. But the war was not over, and it was about to get uglier. In 1970, Nixon expanded the war into Cambodia, without telling Congress, without warning. He claimed it was necessary to cut off enemy supply lines. But to many Americans, it felt like betrayal. The war was supposed to be ending. Instead, it was widening. College campuses erupted. At Kent State University in Ohio, students protested. The National Guard came. Tensions flared. And then gunfire. 13 seconds. 67 bullets. 4 students dead. Some had not even been protesting. They were walking to class. The photo of a young woman kneeling over a fallen body became seared into the national memory. Another line crossed. Another wound opened. And yet still, the war dragged on. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, revealed what many had feared, that presidents from both parties had long misled the public about the war. That victory had been uncertain for years, that lives were lost, not just in battle, but in confusion, in cover-ups, in politics. Trust in government crumbled. At the same time, Nixon was reshaping the country. He pushed what he called the Southern Strategy, appealing to white voters angry over civil rights. He slowed down integration. He attacked the press. He created enemies, students, journalists, urban elites, and painted himself as the defender of the silent majority. He was cunning, paranoid, brilliant, and increasingly obsessed with control. Still, he opened China. In 1972, Nixon visited Beijing, something unthinkable just years before. He shook hands with Mao Zedong. America watched in disbelief. The Cold War had a new wrinkle. A door had opened. That same year, Nixon won re-election in a landslide. He carried 49 states. But the cracks had already begun to show. In June 1972, 5 men were arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington. It seemed like a small story. At first, another political misstep, another campaign stunt. But something felt off. Meanwhile, Vietnam finally began to unwind. In 1973, under intense public pressure and through secret talks led by Henry Kissinger, the U.S. and North Vietnam signed a peace agreement. American troops would leave. Prisoners would be exchanged. The fighting supposedly would stop. The last American combat troops left Vietnam that spring. The war was over, at least for America. But the cost remained. Over 58,000 Americans dead, hundreds of thousands wounded, countless Vietnamese lives lost, soldiers, civilians, children, a nation fractured, a generation disillusioned. There were no parades, no victory speeches, just silence. And behind that silence in the halls of power, Watergate was beginning to boil. Watergate and the fall of a president. You could almost feel it unravel. By early 1973, America was trying to breathe again. The troops were finally out of Vietnam. The war, at least for American families, was over. But the country was tired, suspicious, bruised. And then came Watergate. It had started the year before, barely noticed. 5 men caught inside the offices of the Democratic National Committee. They had break-in tools, surveillance gear. One of them had ties to the White House, but Nixon called it a third-rate burglary. For months, he denied involvement. His aides circled the wagons. The press poked and prodded. And 2 reporters from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, kept digging. What they found was not just a crime. It was a pattern. Bribery, wiretaps, lists of enemies, secret funds, a culture of paranoia where loyalty mattered more than law. The Senate launched an investigation. America watched the hearings live in color. Every day, new revelations, tapes, testimonies, a portrait of a presidency obsessed with enemies and revenge. The president had a secret recording system in the Oval Office, every word captured. And those tapes, those fragile reels of magnetic memory, became the key. Nixon fought to keep them hidden. The courts disagreed. In 1974, the Supreme Court ruled he must hand them over. No man, not even the president, was above the law. When the tapes were finally released, the truth was plain. There was a gap, a missing 18.5 minutes forever lost, but what remained was enough. Nixon had known. He had tried to cover it up. He had lied repeatedly to the American people. And so, on August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon appeared on television. He looked tired, smaller. He spoke slowly without tears, but the weight of the moment was visible. He said he would resign. Not because he was guilty, he never admitted that, but because the nation needed healing. The next day, he boarded a helicopter on the White House lawn. He turned. He raised his arms in his signature V sign. And then he was gone. Gerald Ford became president, an unelected man elevated by history. He promised honesty, stability, calm. But a month later, he pardoned Nixon. "I do not believe that the country could stand prolonged agony," Ford said. "Our long national nightmare is over." Many disagreed. Some saw the pardon as mercy. Others saw it as betrayal. Trust in government, already damaged by Vietnam, now seemed broken beyond repair. The presidency, once cloaked in reverence, now looked flawed, human, and fallible. At the same time, America kept moving. The mid-1970s were gray, unsure. Inflation was rising. Gas prices spiked. Long lines at the pump. Unemployment creeping upward. Factories closing. Cities struggling. The post-war boom was over. In 1975, the last American helicopters lifted off the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Desperate South Vietnamese clung to the skids. Below them, North Vietnamese troops entered the city. The South surrendered. The war was truly over now, and it had not been won. That image, those choppers in the sky, the embassy falling, became a symbol of defeat, of promises made and broken, of a generation's reckoning. Back home, there was disco. There were leisure suits and lava lamps. There was also growing anxiety. The Cold War still loomed. The Middle East was increasingly unstable, and America was unsure of its place in the world. But there were bright spots. In 1976, the country turned 200. The bicentennial. Red, white, and blue bunting draped the streets. Tall ships sailed into harbors. Parades, fireworks, Sousa marches. For a brief moment, Americans allowed themselves to feel proud, to celebrate not the moment they were in, but the ideals they still believed in. Liberty, democracy, resilience. And in that spirit, they elected a new president, Jimmy Carter, a peanut farmer from Georgia. Soft-spoken, religious, an outsider. He promised honesty after so much deceit, compassion after so much cynicism. But the storms were far from over. Carter's crisis years. He walked instead of riding in a limousine. On Inauguration Day in January 1977, Jimmy Carter stepped out of his motorcade and walked down Pennsylvania Avenue hand in hand with his wife Rosalind. It was a small gesture, but it felt symbolic, humble, honest. And after the bruising years of Watergate and Vietnam, Americans welcomed humility. Carter promised to restore trust, to be a different kind of president, a man of faith, of decency. He spoke not like a politician, but like a neighbor. But the world did not wait for him to settle in. Almost immediately, the country felt the weight of an economy slipping out of control. Inflation rose steadily. So did unemployment. The term stagflation entered everyday language: economic stagnation with high inflation, something economists once thought impossible. Interest rates soared. Mortgage payments became unbearable. Gas prices rose again. Lines at fuel stations snaked around city blocks. Tempers flared. And people asked, why is this still happening? Carter, in his cardigans and fireside chats, tried to explain. He called for sacrifice for conservation. He installed solar panels on the White House roof. He encouraged turning down the thermostat. But Americans were tired of being told to sacrifice. They wanted answers, not sweaters. And then came 1979. In January, the Shah of Iran, a longtime American ally, fled his country amid a wave of protests and revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini, a radical cleric, returned from exile and seized control. Iran became a theocracy overnight. America had lost a powerful partner in the Middle East. Worse, the chaos sparked another oil crisis. Prices spiked again. But that was not the end. In November 1979, a mob stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. 52 American diplomats and citizens were taken hostage for days, then weeks, then months. The crisis was broadcast into American homes nightly. Grainy footage of blindfolded hostages, angry chants of "Death to America," flags burning, students shouting into cameras. It felt like humiliation. And Carter, despite working tirelessly behind the scenes, appeared powerless. He authorized a rescue mission. It failed. A sandstorm mechanical failure and a crash in the desert left 8 American servicemen dead. No hostages rescued. More national pain. Back home, discontent simmered. Carter had given a televised address in July, not long before the embassy seizure. It became infamous. Though it was intended to rally the nation, many saw it as scolding. He spoke of a crisis of confidence. He said Americans had become too materialistic, too self-indulgent. Some agreed, but many felt lectured. blamed. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union saw an opening. In December 1979, they invaded Afghanistan. It was the first time Soviet troops had moved beyond their borders since World War II. Carter, who had hoped to ease Cold War tensions, responded with fury. He imposed sanctions, pulled out of the Moscow Olympics, began arming Afghan fighters, and announced a new military doctrine the United States would use force, if necessary, to protect its interests in the Persian Gulf. It was a pivot, from diplomacy to deterrence, from patience to pressure. But for many Americans, it felt too late. By 1980, Carter's approval ratings were low, very low. The economy was still struggling. The hostages were still captive. The mood of the country was bleak. And then came a challenger. Ronald Reagan, a former actor, governor of California, charismatic, optimistic. He smiled on stage, spoke of morning in America, promised strength abroad and prosperity at home. "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" he asked. For many, the answer was no. On Election Day, Reagan won in a landslide. But there was one final act in Carter's presidency. On January 20th, 1981, minutes after Reagan took the oath of office, the hostages were released. After 404 days in captivity, they were coming home. Carter had negotiated their release, but he was not there to receive credit. He had boarded a plane that very day to greet the freed Americans in Germany quietly, far from the cameras. A quiet ending for a quiet man. History would later view Carter more kindly. His post-presidency became one of the most admired in American history, dedicated to peace, democracy, and human rights. But in those final days of the 1970s, he seemed like a man out of step with the country he loved. The nation was ready to turn the page. And as the 1980s began, the lights got a little brighter. The music got a little louder. The confidence came rushing back. Or at least, that was the illusion. Looking back on a century's edge. It was strange looking back from the edge of a new century. After all the noise, all the protests, speeches, crises, and celebrations, what remained were quieter things. A song you heard on the radio in 1965. The scent of gas during the shortages. The sound of your father cursing at the television during Watergate. Or the way your grandmother cried when Kennedy died. History had not just been headlines. It had been lived minute by minute. In schools and diners, in marriages and divorces, in long drives down unfamiliar roads, in dreams that rose and fell with every new president. And through it all, the country changed. It got messier, more complicated, louder, but also more honest. The myths peeled away. No longer the innocent giant of the 1940s, nor the restless rebel of the 1960s, nor the cynical power of the 1970s. America in 1980 stood older, maybe wiser, still divided, but still moving. The children of the Depression had grown old. The soldiers of World War II were now grandfathers. Those who marched in Selma were raising teenagers, and those teenagers were about to usher in the strangest decade yet. But all that was still to come. Tonight we end with the stillness of that moment before the lights changed again. Before the Cold War flared back up. Before computers moved into every home. Before the towers rose and eventually fell. The 20th century of America had been many things. Glorious, shameful, inspiring, exhausting, but above all, unforgettable. And maybe that is what history really is. Not the dates, not the treaties, or the wars, but the feeling, the breath we held, the dreams we tried to catch, the people we became because of it all. So now, my friend, close your eyes. We have reached the edge of the century, and a new story is waiting. Good night.